Welcome. Today, we're immersing ourselves in one of Canada's most persistent and, frankly, most painful cold cases.
It's a story that spans 44 years.
Exactly. It all began with a truly horrific discovery in a septic tank in rural Alberta. For decades, the victim was known only by this grim moniker, Septic Tank Sam.
In this case, it really captures the frustrating limitations of investigations back then in the past. But it also, on the other side of that coin, shows the revolutionary power of modern technology.
It really does. The body was found way back in 1977.
1977. And for generations, he remained a John Doe, an unnamed victim. This wasn't just some local puzzle. It really became a symbol of a crime that just seemed to have been erased by time.
So we've been meticulously going through the documented history of this entire investigation. We've looked at everything from the initial crime scene to the decades of, well, a failure, really.
And then finally, the eventual dramatic identification process.
Our focus here is to trace that entire journey, from the Tofield John Doe all the way to his true identity, Gordon Edwin Sanderson.
Our mission today is critical. We need to fully understand the monumental forensic persistence that's required in a case this challenging. We'll explore the methods they used, from the pioneering, almost analog 3D facial reconstructions of the 1970s.
Which were cutting edge at the time.
Absolutely. And we'll trace it all the way to the breakthrough success of genetic genealogy in the 2020s. But we also have to acknowledge the devastating impact this had on a small community.
And most importantly, explore the life of the victim himself and the systemic context that surrounded his tragic death.
Yes. And given the violence that's described in the source material, we need to approach this discussion with a great deal of solemnity and respect.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our conversation begins not with the crime scene, but with the man himself.
Gordon Edwin Sanderson.
And the life he lived before he was so violently taken. Gordon Edwin Sanderson was born on October 20th, 1950, in Manitoba, Canada.
So he was only 26 years old at the time he went missing.
It's just 26. And that was sometime between 1976 and the spring of 1977. For the public record, for decades, he was defined only by his tragic death. But the material we've reviewed emphasizes that his life was, well, it was complex and defined by early systemic hardship.
That context is absolutely essential to understanding the full picture. The records reveal that Gordon Sanderson was an Indigenous man.
Yes.
And his early life was shaped by a devastating and far-reaching historical policy known as the 60s scoop.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain what that was?
Of course. This was a truly dark period in Canadian history. Starting in the 1960s, thousands of Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families, from their communities. Often without any parental or band consent. They were placed into the child welfare system, and overwhelmingly that meant being placed into non-Indigenous foster homes.
It sounds like an immediate fracture in his entire foundation. At what age was he placed into foster care?
He was only 9 years old. Just try to imagine the profound trauma inherent in that kind of displacement. The 60s scoop wasn't just about changing homes. It was about severing cultural, linguistic, and familial ties. It led to this profound loss of identity, of belonging.
So the children who went through this system.
The children who survived this system, yes.
Yeah.
They frequently faced immense challenges. You see patterns of struggles with mental health, homelessness, substance abuse, and disproportionate interactions with the criminal justice system.
So when we look at the later details in his life, the fact that he reportedly struggled with addictions and had various run-ins with police, as mentioned in the public sources, it feels impossible to separate those struggles from the systemic consequences of the 60s scoop.
You can't.
His biography immediately becomes less about individual choice and more about a vulnerability that was created by historical policy.
Exactly. The very systems that were supposed to protect him ultimately created a path of instability. By the mid-1970s, he was living in Edmonton, and the sources give us one last glimmer of hope and connection. The last known intention he ever shared with his family was a plan to visit his brother, Arthur, in Calgary.
So he was trying to connect with family.
He was attempting to navigate a life that was often characterized by immense instability, and he was seeking out family, seeking out that connection.
That detail, that he was on a journey toward family, is just incredibly poignant knowing what we know now. It grounds him not just as a statistic, a cold case, but as a person a person with a family who loved him and was waiting for him.
And we know now, thanks to the later identification process, that he was more than just a brother. He was also a father.
He had a daughter.
He had a daughter, and potentially an entire lineage of descendants who spent over 4 decades living with the agonizing ambiguity of a missing person case, the uncertainty of a disappearance. It's often so much worse than the certainty of a death, and his family carried that terrible burden for 44 years.
That intended journey, then, from Edmonton toward his brother in Calgary, was so tragically intercepted, and it led him instead to an abandoned piece of rural property in Lynbrook.
And that's where his story became a high-profile, devastating cold case.
The discovery itself has this grim, almost cinematic quality, because the location was so unassuming. We're talking about Lynbrook, Alberta.
A quiet farming area.
Very quiet. It's about 13 kilometers west of the small town of Tofield. And the date was April 13th, 1977.
And the location really adds to the disturbing nature of the crime. This wasn't a place that was visited by strangers. It was an abandoned property.
So the discovery was completely accidental.
Purely accidental. The sources are very clear on this. A local couple who owned the land went out there on that spring day, and they weren't investigating anything suspicious. They were just looking for a septic tank pump.
Just doing chores on their property.
Exactly. And they needed to access the tank to perform some maintenance or maybe just salvage a piece of equipment.
And when they peered into the opening of that 1.8-meter deep septic tank, that's about 6 feet down, what they saw was something no one could possibly be prepared for.
No. They saw what was later confirmed to be a human leg just bobbing in the sewage.
Horrifying.
That single visual detail, a leg bobbing in the waste, is what seared this case into the memory of the community and the investigators for decades. It instantly transformed a routine rural maintenance check into a high-stakes, horrific crime scene.
The local Tofield RCMP detachment was alerted immediately. But, I mean, given this was a rural unit in 1977, they were certainly not equipped for a recovery operation of this nature. Can you describe the challenges they faced in just getting the body out?
The recovery effort really highlights the improvised and arduous nature of rural policing back then. 2 officers were immediately dispatched to the scene.
Just 2.
The tank was, as you said, about 1.8 meters deep. The officers had to spend an entire hour just attempting to empty the tank to get access to the remains.
An hour? How did they do it?
The specific detail noted in the investigation materials is just astonishing. Lacking any specialized vacuum or pumping equipment, they used an empty ice cream pail.
An ice cream pail?
An empty ice cream pail,
Wow.
manually scooping out the contents of the tank.
So they were essentially wading through that environment to manually empty it with a makeshift scoop. That just demonstrates an incredible level of dedication, or maybe just a necessary visceral commitment to duty in the face of what must have been an unbearable scene.
It was physically and psychologically grueling work. There's no other way to put it. Once the officers were finally able to retrieve the body, its initial appearance provided some critical, albeit limited, physical clues.
What did they see?
The body was decomposed, but it was wrapped in a yellow bedsheet, and it was tightly secured with nylon rope.
Which immediately tells you something.
It instantly told investigators that the perpetrators intended to conceal the remains. They had premeditated the dumping. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act.
And the clothing. Did the items they recovered provide any immediate leads for them?
The clothing was meticulously documented. He was wearing a blue Levi's shirt with snap buttons, a gray T-shirt underneath it, blue jeans, and imitation wallaby shoes.
So pretty common clothes for the era.
Extremely common. These were mass-produced items, common in the mid-70s, which didn't immediately point to a specific individual or location, but they were the victim's only link to the outside world. And the forensic teams had to rely heavily on these details, the size, the brand, the specific style, in their initial and ultimately unsuccessful attempts to match them to missing persons reports.
It just speaks volumes that, despite that immense effort by the officers, recovering every scrap of evidence from that environment, the clothes and the body itself weren't enough. Not enough to provide an identification for 4 decades.
Oh.
So the investigation immediately moved from the field into the forensic realm, where the sheer brutality of the crime would become the central focus. The first critical phase of the forensic examination was determining the cause of death.
And it was immediately ruled a homicide.
But the specifics were terrifying. The medical examiner confirmed the victim had suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one to the head and one to the chest.
But they also acknowledged that, due to the state of the remains, it was entirely possible there were more bullet wounds that just hadn't left marks on the skeleton.
So the gunshots established the cause of death.
Hmm.
But you mentioned brutality.
Yes. What truly defines this cold case and why investigators initially suspected the perpetrators knew the victim was the extensive evidence of torture that preceded the shooting.
This wasn't a quick crime.
Not at all. The records detail a level of vicious, prolonged brutality that suggests intense personal animosity or maybe a criminal debt settlement gone horribly, horribly wrong.
We're talking about a severe beating, correct?
Yes, Gordon Sanderson had been severely beaten. But beyond that, the way he was restrained was evident. Investigators found distinct burn marks on his shirt sleeves,
Burn marks.
which led to the theory that he had been tied up, possibly to something like a bed frame, during the torture session.
My goodness.
The sources indicate the calculated, sadistic methods that were used. He was burned repeatedly using a small butane torch and cigarettes.
That level of intentional, non-lethal violence suggests the primary motive was just inflicting pain, not robbery or a quick disposal.
Precisely. It implies a significant investment of time by the perpetrators. And then we arrive at the most challenging detail for the medical examiner:
Which was?
the severe trauma and mutilation inflicted with a sharp object. The medical examiner suspected the instrument used was likely farm shears, given the nature of the wounds, although this couldn't be definitively proven.
And the violence was so horrific that the medical examiner in Edmonton had difficulty even confirming the victim's gender.
It took several months for the medical examiner to positively confirm the victim was male, precisely because of the extent of the sexual mutilation. This is a critical detail. It speaks to the severity of the attack, and it created both a forensic hurdle and a narrative clue for investigators.
What kind of clue?
The viciousness, the tying, the burning, and the specific nature of the mutilation led investigators to strongly believe that the murderers knew Sanderson. Strangers typically do not dedicate this much time and malice to a victim. This kind of brutality usually stems from deeply personal or deeply involved criminal associations.
And beyond the violence inflicted on the body, the perpetrators attempted to conceal the evidence itself. The body was covered in quicklime.
Yes.
The sources suggest this was done in a mistaken effort to accelerate decomposition. What does quicklime actually do in an environment like a septic tank, and why might that have complicated the investigation later on?
Well, quicklime, or calcium oxide, is highly alkaline. The perpetrators likely hoped that this caustic substance, combined with the anaerobic environment of the septic tank, would quickly dissolve the remains. It's a common trope in crime fiction.
But it's a misunderstanding of the science.
It's often a misunderstanding, yes. While it can accelerate degradation in some organic material in certain environments, particularly if the concentration isn't perfect, it can actually create a dry, chemically hostile environment that hardens tissue or, ironically, aids in preservation.
So it could have actually helped preserve the body.
In a way, yes. But most critically for the investigation, it severely changes the chemical environment. That can destroy delicate trace evidence and contaminate DNA samples, making analysis much, much harder decades later.
And compounding all of this complexity was a devastating initial misstep in the forensic process:
A catastrophic early error.
the misidentification of the victim's race.
Yes, the medical examiner in Edmonton initially determined Sanderson to be Caucasian. Because the case immediately became a national story, this racial designation directed all the initial missing person searches exclusively toward Caucasian males across Western Canada.
So they weren't looking for him at all.
They weren't looking in the right place. This one assumption effectively sidelined any inquiries into the Indigenous community missing persons files, which, as we now know, is where the answer truly lay. This misdirection contributed massively to the 44-year delay.
It just underscores the danger of assumptions in forensic science, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable populations whose disappearances might already be underreported or overlooked.
Absolutely. Though we criticize that initial racial misidentification, we also have to acknowledge the meticulous nature of some of the other early forensic work.
For example.
For example, the autopsy confirmed that based on the structure of his bones and teeth, Sanderson had suffered from an unspecified severe illness when he was approximately 5 years old.
A detail from his childhood.
A seemingly small piece of biographical and medical history, a marker of past drama. And this would later become a crucial confirmation point for the forensic anthropologists who were working on the profile.
So, with the victim misidentified by race and the complexity of the crime scene, the investigation quickly stalled. It went from a front-page story into a high-priority cold case file.
And the initial investigation focused on profiling Sam and his likely killers.
And what was that profile?
The authorities were convinced he wasn't local. The early thinking strongly suggested he was transient, perhaps a migrant laborer moving between provinces for work, which would explain why he wasn't reported missing in the Tuffield area.
Right, that makes sense.
But the key piece of deduction was about the crime scene itself. The lack of blood or any sign of a struggle within the septic tank strongly suggested it was purely a disposal site.
So the murder and the torture had occurred elsewhere.
Likely in Edmonton or somewhere along the route to Calgary. And the body was then transported to that abandoned property.
Which meant the killers had two different profiles, in a way. Someone who knew the victim personally enough to inflict that level of brutality.
And someone familiar enough with the Lynbrook area to know that specific abandoned tank was a good dumping spot.
A difficult combination to track down.
Precisely. Investigators suspected the murderers were either Tuffield locals or at least intimately familiar with that rural geography. This split profiling a personal crime but a local disposal created a challenging dichotomy for the RCMP. They had to investigate vicious criminal associations in the city while simultaneously conducting discrete inquiries in the quiet small-town setting of Tuffield.
And since the traditional identification methods failed, there were no matching dental records, no fingerprints, the case pivoted to what was, for the late 1970s, cutting-edge forensic anthropology. This is where the commitment of the RCMP truly stands out. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really is. It shows that even in the analog age, investigators were willing to go to extreme lengths. In 1979, just 2 years after the discovery, Sanderson's body was exhumed.
His first exhumation.
And it was flown, in fact, all the way down to Oklahoma. This was an unprecedented expenditure and collaboration for a single Canadian John Doe case at that time.
And the experts they consulted were the absolute pioneers of forensic identification.
They were legends in the field. The team included Dr. Clyde Snow, who was arguably the most renowned forensic anthropologist of the 20th century.
He was famous for his work on some very high-profile cases.
Yes, identifying the victims of John Wayne Gacy and the remains of Joseph Mengele. And working alongside him was Betty Pat Gatliff, a medical illustrator who was pioneering the technique of 3D facial composite reconstruction. She'd been sculpting faces onto skulls since the 1960s.
For our listeners, can we just touch on the technical skill required for Gatliff's work? She wasn't just guessing, she was performing a forensic science.
It was meticulous, applied anatomy. Gatliff's method involved placing these small pegs of known lengths onto various points of the skull to represent the average tissue depth for specific areas, the nose, the chin, the cheeks, based on existing anthropological data. She would then apply clay over those pegs, sculpting the muscle and skin structure to recreate a lifelike composite face from the underlying bone structure.
So it's a reconstruction, not an artist's sketch.
Exactly. This composite was then rendered in plaster or clay and widely distributed, just hoping for public recognition.
And this 1979 examination in Oklahoma provided critical physical data beyond just that public composite. What did Dr. Snow determine?
Well, by measuring the victim's hands, they determined he was right-handed. A small detail, but potentially useful.
But he found something much more significant.
He did. The most significant finding was Snow's firm conclusion regarding the victim's ancestry and age. Based on craniofacial measurements, that's specific ratios and shapes of the skull, Snow concluded that the victim was indigenous.
Indigenous.
And that he was likely older than initially believed, around 35 years old. This directly contradicted the Edmonton Medical Examiner's initial determination of a Caucasian male in his late 20s.
So a globally recognized expert, Dr. Snow, instantly refuted the initial fundamental forensic conclusion that had been drawn by the local medical examiner.
Yeah.
Why was that contradiction not enough to solve the case right then and there?
It really highlights the limitations of the technology at the time. Snow's finding was based on his expert opinion and anthropological measurement, but it couldn't be definitively proven without a genetic marker or a confirmed missing persons match.
And the damage from the initial misidentification was already done?
It was. The initial error had already steered the massive resources away from the Indigenous missing persons files. And furthermore, the RCMP was likely heavily invested in their initial younger age range. So despite Snow's expert opinion, the lack of a name meant they couldn't simply undo years of misdirected investigation overnight.
But the investigation persisted, even as the decades passed, and that commitment is evidenced by a second reconstruction attempt 21 years later.
Correct. The need for a fresh look, using newer technology, led to Sanderson being exhumed for the second time in the year 2000.
A second time?
This reconstruction was led by Cyril Chan of the Edmonton Medical Examiner's Office, and this really demonstrates the incredible institutional memory and persistence within the RCMP. They simply refused to let this file go cold, even as the original investigators retired. The new reconstruction hoped to utilize improved digital imaging techniques to create a clearer, more public-friendly image.
While the police were pouring all these resources into the case, and the sources mention a staggering $1 million was spent, we need to talk about the impact this unidentified horror had on the community of Tewfield.
The psychological impact was immense. Tewfield was a town of only 1,200 residents,
Tiny.
a quiet agrarian community where violent crime was unheard of. The sources clearly document the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that just settled over the area. Farmers who relied on septic tanks themselves felt compelled to check their own property, worried about whether they had a similar hidden grade nearby.
The violation of that rural peace must have been profound.
It was. And the suspicion wasn't just aimed at outsiders. Business owners in Tewfield began to look at their regular clientele, wondering if the murderer was someone they served coffee to every single morning.
And that fear, that lack of answers, led to the inevitable local speculation filling the information vacuum.
Yes, and that speculation, sadly, often targeted the victim. The record suggests that the extreme sexual mutilation led to terrible, unfounded rumors about the victim's moral character.
What kind of rumors?
The speculation suggested the mutilation was because the victim had committed a sex crime or had been unfaithful in a relationship. This is a common and tragic phenomenon you see in cold cases, where the brutality of the crime is somehow blamed on the victim, which just adds another layer of injustice and disrespect to the original injury.
And what about the human toll on the officers who were involved from day one?
It was deeply taxing. Officer Ed Lammerts, he was one of the 2 RCMP officers who manually emptied the tank with the ice cream pail back in '77. He retired before the case was solved.
What did he think?
He publicly stated he believed the case would never be closed. Just think of the psychological weight that carries to dedicate so much time and effort, including spending $1 million, only to feel you failed.
And that $1 million, just to be clear, that funded extensive analog efforts.
It did. Sending x-rays to over 800 dentists across the province, publishing dental diagrams in national journals, and funding the transport and forensic analysis in Oklahoma. It was a massive financial commitment for a single John Doe case.
So 2 reconstructions, 2 generations of forensic experts, $1 million spent, and a community scarred. And yet, 44 years later, still no name.
Still no name.
The case stood deadlocked for decades. It was a perfect example of a crime solved in every way but the most essential one: identification. But the solution arrived with the maturation of genetic genealogy, which bypassed all the previous forensic limitations.
This represents a tectonic shift in cold case investigation. By the late 2010s, police forces all over the world began turning to specialized private labs.
Why private labs?
Because the traditional federal police databases, like CODIS, they only contain DNA from known offenders or from other unidentified bodies. To find a connection, to build a family tree, they needed to search civilian databases.
And that's where Othram Inc., a private laboratory in Texas, enters the story. What exactly did Othram do that the RCMP labs couldn't?
Othram specializes in taking incredibly degraded, contaminated, or minute samples of DNA, like the DNA from remains that had been sitting in quicklime and sewage for 44 years, and performing advanced sequencing. They use a technique called whole genome sequencing, or WGS.
Which is much more powerful than the standard methods.
Much more powerful. They look for something called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, across the entire genome to build a highly detailed genetic profile.
This just seems like a massive leap over the forensics of the 1970s. So how does Othram turn that recovered DNA into an identity?
They upload that comprehensive profile to public genealogy databases, the sites that millions of people use to find out about their heritage.
Ah, I see.
They aren't looking for the victim himself in the database. They're looking for third cousins, second cousins, or even more distant relatives who have uploaded their own DNA seeking family connections.
From there.
This process allows forensic genealogists to build a massive family tree backward and then forward, tracing common ancestors until they narrow down the identity to one specific branch of one specific family.
The identification process for Gordon Sanderson must have been lengthy, given the degradation of the sample.
It was, but ultimately it was successful. Based on the genetic profile, Othram was able to connect Septic Tank Sam to a specific family tree in Manitoba.
And this genetic evidence confirmed what Dr. Snow had said decades earlier.
It strongly suggested the indigenous ancestry that Dr. Clyde Snow had asserted all the way back in 1979. Gordon Sanderson was finally identified in January of 2021.
And the final step, which is crucial for legal admissibility, is getting a close relative's DNA for absolute confirmation.
That's correct. Once the genetic genealogy pointed conclusively toward the Sanderson family, investigators contacted a close relative, his older sister. Her DNA sample was used to confirm beyond any doubt that Septic Tank Sam was, in fact, Gordon Edwin Sanderson. A 44-year mystery was solved, confirming his name, his age, and his indigenous heritage.
The public announcement arrived months later, on June 30, 2021. The Alberta RCMP held a press conference to finally give the public, and more importantly, his family, the answer they had waited for.
And the impact was immediate and profound. The announcement confirmed he was a 26-year-old Indigenous man from Manitoba who had been living in Edmonton. The cold case file was instantly reclassified as an active homicide investigation.
And restored context to his disappearance.
His family finally knew the grim answer to what happened after he set out to visit his brother Arthur in Calgary all those years ago.
And knowing who he was allows the police to focus the investigation on his life and his connections rather than just that isolated crime scene. What do the authorities now believe regarding the perpetrators?
Well, the police have focused their efforts primarily on the Edmonton area. They believe that Sanderson was killed by associates who are likely involved in various criminal acts.
Which aligns with the early theories.
It aligns perfectly with the early theory that the viciousness of the crime implied the killers knew him well, likely through those criminal associations or debts. However, the police have also had to face a very difficult reality.
Which is?
The passage of 44 years means that the perpetrators of this heinous crime may no longer be alive to face justice.
That is a deeply sobering realization. That even after achieving the monumental success of identification, it may not lead to a prosecution.
It speaks to the bittersweet nature of these breakthroughs. For the family, the identity is closure. They know where their loved one is and how he died. But the legal justice component remains tenuous due to the simple attrition of time.
So Gordon Edwin Sanderson's story is this compelling case study tracing the evolution of forensic science from the highly specialized analog work of the 1970s to the vast digital power of modern genetic databases. It just highlights the incredible persistence of investigators across 4 decades.
And for you, the listener, this case demonstrates 2 crucial points. First, the incredible endurance of cold case units. They never gave up. And second, the power of technological innovation to overcome even the most fundamental initial errors.
Right.
Genetic genealogy succeeded where the initial investigation failed. It corrected the initial racial misidentification, it cut through the contamination of the quicklime, and ultimately it gave a name back to a man who'd been defined only by the terrible manner of his death.
But his story, it transcends forensic technique. It brings us back to the broader societal context we talked about at the start.
Absolutely. The identification confirms that Gordon Sanderson was an Indigenous man and a documented victim of the 60s scoop. The records we've reviewed implicitly link his case to the systemic issues of vulnerability and violence experienced by Indigenous peoples in Canada, issues that, regrettably, continue to this day.
His life story serves as a painful illustration of the cascading consequences of historical policies that tore families apart.
It does. And this raises an important question that extends far beyond Topfield. When genetic genealogy is more widely applied to the thousands of historical unidentified remains found across North America, how many other John Does or Jane Does will be found to share similar backgrounds? Backgrounds of displacement, poverty, and systemic vulnerability.
Staggering thought.
Sanderson's identification is a crucial step in reconciliation, simply by restoring dignity and history to a man whose identity was stolen by violence and obscured by circumstance. Every historical John Doe has a story, a family, and a context that deserves recognition.
Despite the definitive identification of Gordon Edwin Sanderson and the fact that his family finally knows his fate, the brutal perpetrators of this heinous crime were never publicly identified or charged. This case serves as a poignant reminder that identification is often only the first, though essential, step toward achieving justice.
The decades-long search for Gordon Edwin Sanderson is over. The search for his killer, however, remains an active, unfinished effort.
Thank you for trusting us with this extensive analysis of the source material regarding the life and identification of Gordon Edwin Sanderson.
We appreciate you listening closely to this complex material.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.